Today is the day. It's been weeks since you've been out on the water and you're finally going to get out there and fish. You get out there, the conditions are just right. You pull out your favorite crankbait, you know, the one that's caught 6 or 7 bass previously, and you throw it out there and you start cranking it back. Third cast, you throw it out there, you're cranking it back, and all of a sudden it just stops and you realize you just got snagged. Today on Fish Den 365, we're going to talk about a bunch of different methods for getting your bait back when you get snagged. Alright, it's happened to everybody. Everybody has their own ways of trying to get their snags back, and today, more than ever, it can be more expensive than anything because these baits today cost so much, especially treble hook baits, which are the ones that tend to get snagged the most because they're not weedless in any way. And so we're going to be focusing our discussion today on mainly treble hook baits. So let's talk about it a little bit. You know, when you get hung up, there's a number of things to think about. First of all, the bait that you're using actually makes a difference. If I'm fishing a spoon or a blade bait, this is a heavy chunk of metal, right? It's got lead in it and it's heavy. So when I get those hung up, the first thing I do is I'll shake my rod violently. I'll have a little bit of slack in that line and I'll shake the rod from different angles, up high, off to the right, off to the left. I'll just keep shaking it. And you know, don't give up on that right away because many times you can shake it loose and get it off that way. After I do that and I can't get it off, the very next thing I'll do is I'll make sure I go around to the other side, the opposite angle from where I hooked it. So if I'm sitting here and I hooked it in this direction, I'm going to take my boat and come all the way around over here. If you're on the bank, you might not have that luxury. You might only be able to change the angle a little bit, but it's still worth trying that, walking on the bank to get that different angle to shake the bait loose. These techniques that I'm going to go over, most of them will work from the bank fisherman's perspective as well. So I go around the other side, I shake, trying to get it loose, can't get it loose. You know, but a good percentage of the time, maybe 30% on especially spoons and blade baits, I get them off, you know, I'd say 30% of the time just by shaking it violently like that. If that doesn't work, the very next thing that I do is called the bow and arrow, and this is when you hold your rod in a position, you tight line you have your line tight, and what you do is you pull some line, you grab some line near the first guide, the guide that's closest to you, and you pull it towards you, and it's going to bend your rod down a little bit, and then you let go. And what that does is, I call it bow and arrow, what that does is it flexes the rod downward as you pull that line. So you're stretching your line a little bit, you're flexing that rod, but then when you let go, the rod pops back, the line pops back, and many times that'll free the bait up as well. So that's my next trick. If shaking doesn't work, and this works, by the way, with crankbaits and all other types of treble hook lures as well. Shaking can too, but it works best with spoons and blade baits and those kind of things. So shaking's always worth giving a try. But if you can't get it off after you've moved and tried to go to the other side, use the bow and arrow trick, and use the bow and arrow trick from a number of different angles because that can make a difference as well. I'll do that several times. I'll shake it again. I'll use the two in combination. I'll do that bow and arrow. I'll shake, go different angles. Hopefully you'll get it off that way. And you know, with that bow and arrow trick, you're getting closer to a higher percentage to getting that off because oftentimes that will free that bait for you too. Now, if that doesn't work, the next thing that I do is I get a lead weight like this. I like to use a triangle weight, and what I do is I just buy these. They're real cheap. I buy these at any tackle store, and I put a snap on it. I take a snap apart, I put the bottom part of the snap on here and put it back together, and then I have the snap, the part that opens up that you would put your bait on. You'd slide that onto your line. So you open the snap, you put this on your line, you close the snap, you hold your rod up and you let it slide down your line. I like a 3-ounce weight. I've tried many different shapes, circles, cylinders, egg shapes. The best that seem to work, one that works the best for me is a triangle, and the reason why, a pyramid I should say, and the reason why I think the pyramid works good is because it can wedge between branches and pop that lure free. And so I like a 3-ounce. Anything bigger than that gets a little bit cumbersome. Oftentimes you might think, well, more weight might be better, but then you have bigger sides and sometimes it can get hooked on tree branches before it ever gets to your bait. So that's why I like the 3 ounce. It's heavy enough to get the job done, and I'll just get over the bait, let it sink down there. Once it gets all the way down to the bait, I'll pop the rod a few times, because what that'll do is, if the line has a little slack in it, it'll pop this up and it'll come back down again. It pops it up, comes back down. So oftentimes you can free it up after doing that a few times. And so with those techniques that we just mentioned, the shaking, the bow and arrow trick, the sliding the weight down the line, it gets me free at least 50% of the time, probably more, probably closer to 60 or 70%. So, and the couple things you have to be aware of with this is, depending on how you're snagged, this could wear your line out a little bit where the bait is. So when you do get your bait back, you might have to cut a couple inches of line and retie. If it's all curled up and it doesn't feel right and it feels weak, don't mess with that, because you could lose the fish of a lifetime. Just cut a couple inches off, retie, and you're good to go. One of the things that's most difficult to get a bait back from is when I get hung in fishing line, and where I fish, that happens as much as anything else. I get stuck in other people's fishing line. And so the way you know that it's a fishing line versus like a tree branch is sometimes you'll feel the tree branch gives, right? Fishing line, it gives and then it doesn't. And sometimes it'll give more, like what's happening is it's breaking apart or coming loose. And so you get a little more, and then it's stuck again. And so you can keep working that, and if your line's stronger than the fishing line that you're hung on, you can work that, and eventually it'll break free or it'll come free, and you get your bait back. The other thing that sometimes happens is I'll hook onto something very heavy that I can't get free, but it's not heavy enough to break my line. And I don't want to break my rod by reeling up and have the rod bent. So usually what I'll do is I'll point the rod at the object that it's hooked on, and I'll just pull the rod back. And if it starts to give, I put the rod down and I actually just grab the line and pull up. I've pulled up all kinds of crazy stuff. Big anchors, big branches, like tree limbs, stumps, you name it. I've pulled all kinds of stuff up trying to get my baits back. And that works as long as your line is stronger than whatever the weight is of what you're hooked on. But sometimes I'm using pretty heavy line, 15, 20-pound test. You'd be surprised at what you can get into your boat. I mean, one time I had a branch that was as long as the freaking boat, and it was all covered in soot, and it was just a mess. But I got my bait back, and that's the most important thing. So fishing line, you have to kind of mess with that a little differently, because sometimes it can get loose and you can get it back. So those are where I usually stop. Like, I don't go much further than that unless I'm in shallow water. There's a couple of tricks you can use in shallow water and there's a couple other tricks that you can use to get your bait back that we'll mention that I usually don't do, but it's just too much work for the benefit in my mind. So, but let's say you're in shallow water, less than about the length of your fishing rod. So this is one where if you can reach your rod tip, and reach down to the bait, you could actually free it right with your rod tip. Major warning though, you could also break your rod tip very easily. Now, I've done this many, many times, and I've never broken a rod tip. And I'm probably going to be sorry I said that, because the very next time I do it, I'll probably break a rod tip. You got to be careful. You don't want to do this too hard or your tip will break. But what happens with this method is you get hung up, you're in shallow water, you can't get it out, you've tried all those tricks that I've talked about, maybe even trying this. If that doesn't work, you go over it and you just take your rod and reel down to where the snag is. And you dip your rod down in the water, you reel all the way down until you get your rod to where it goes to the bait. And then you just shake your rod tip. And oftentimes that'll get it loose and you can lift it back up. So that's another way to getting out in shallow water. Another method that I've seen people use is sometimes someone will have a telescopic pole or an 8-foot pole, and on the end of that pole it'll have just a little hook on it, or just a little circle of like almost a little spring. And you can put that on your line and then take the pole down there, and now you're not risking your rod and you can get it free that way. So again, those are shallow water techniques to get your bait back. Now, what do you do if you really want your bait back and you're out in deep water and you can't reach it with your pole, the telescopic pole that we talked about, or your rod? There is a couple other things you can do. There's a item out there. It used to be called a bulldog. There's a number of different brands now, so I'm sure they have different names. This thing was a big lead weight that was in the shape of a bulldog. Yeah, it's called a hound dog, not a bulldog. And it had like a large coil on it. And so you would stick your line, you'd slip your line into that coil, and you would have a rope tied to this bulldog, which was heavy, 4 or 5 ounces or more. And you'd slide that down your line, and then you would get that hooked onto your lure. You'd get it hooked onto your hooks and pull it free and pull that way. Now, I've used the Bulldog in the past with some success, but sometimes you can get that thing hung up in kind of a mess too. And if it's windy, the next thing you know, you're fighting it with the boat. And for me, I just felt that I don't use it. I at some point I'll give up and I'll break the line, but I'll try those other methods first. There is one other way that I can think of that sometimes you get your bait back, and that is if you're using hooks that are not as strong as the pound test fishing line that you're using. You'd be surprised. There's a lot of treble hooks that aren't that strong, and they'll bend out straight, and you can straighten your hook out and get your bait back that way. That's happened to me already, more than quite a bit actually. But now the hooks that I choose are stronger, so it happens less and less, and that's what you give up. There's always pros and cons, right? There's always benefits and there's always negatives, and you have to choose what you want to do. And if you really want that bait back, then you probably want to get a hound dog, but you're going to have some struggles using that as well at times. And for me, it's just not worth the time it takes to use it. So, but if and that's another thing about the hooks. If the hooks are weak enough, you can bend them straight and get the bait back that way. But your risk with that is, fish can do that to you too, and you can lose the fish of a lifetime. That's something I don't want to put up with. So I try not to let that happen. So that's it. I think I've just exhausted a lot of my methods for getting out of snag. Would love to hear yours. Please comment. Let me know what you do to get your lures back when they get snagged. Hope this was useful for you. If it was, give me the thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. We'll be back soon with another video. Keep it tuned here. And as always, may God bless your fishing endeavors.